Okay, we'll now move to our next presenter, Nadia Soliman. Nadia is studying for a PhD at Imperial College London. She's also the local network lead there for the UK Reproducibility Network. She has a lot of experience in pharmacology and has recently returned to academia after serving in the regular reserve for the British Army for 10 years. And she's here today to talk about leadership and management in the research community, drawing on her experience in other sectors. Nadia, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me today. I think a lot of the themes that I'll be discussing have already been touched upon, but I'll be doing it through the optics, I suppose, of leadership. So I'll just share my screen. So like you've just introduced, James, I'm coming to the end of my PhD at Imperial College London. I perform preclinical systematic reviews to identify ways to improve the methodological quality and validity of animal pain research so that we can translate those results to the clinic. But today I'll be talking about leadership. I don't have the most orthodox background. I returned to academia after some time in the British Army, and my return, unfortunately, hasn't always been smooth sailing. So for the first time, I'm going to explain a little bit more detail about the start of my academic career, or the restart, to characterize some of the problems that exist in academia and my motivations for talking about leadership. I'll then compare this to my military experiences before ending hopefully on a bit of a higher note about how we can all work together, listen and learn from each other to create a more inclusive, positive research culture which allows researchers to thrive and our research outputs to be of the highest value. So those who know me, have heard me speak before, they'll know that I like to start with a bottom line up front. And for today, that's everyone can be and is a leader. So I'll be challenging the notion or conception or perception that I often hear that when people discuss leadership, and that's leadership is isolated to those informal leadership positions. And what I'll be illustrating throughout my talk is the fundamental principles of leadership, and that these can be embodied by individuals all the way through to institutions. And while situations and roles and responsibilities of leaders can change, the first principles never change. And so leadership is really merely having influence over others, and we all have influence over others. And so even if we're not in a formal leadership role, we do often have informal leadership responsibilities. And so even if you're the most junior person in your team, you can be a really good team player. You can be looking out, speaking up, supporting the team in a variety of ways. And so good leadership can really be modeled by anybody. So I think we can all recognize good and bad leadership. Encapsulating that is not easy, and there isn't a single definition for what leadership is. And that's why I've got such a wordy slide here. The description that I've put up is a model of leadership. It's a transformational model. And this is a theory of leadership where a leader works with a team to identify a task or problem that they want to solve. And the leader guides the team through that problem solving task. They bring the team together, they equip the team, they support the team so that that team can then solve a problem or achieve their task. And it's important to differentiate leadership from management. I often hear leadership being conflated with management. They do go hand in hand, but management is more about the processes. You know, for example, writing a appraisal report or providing student feedback, completing a peer review. You know, paying someone is a management function, but leadership is more about the effort that is put into doing that and the influence and impact that that has on a person or on people. So many of us will be aware of, felt, you know, the impact of that reviewer too, or will have been let down perhaps by a finance department not paying us on time. But then leadership also has this other part to it, and that's sort of this capacity to empathize, to motivate, to support, and to develop. So I graduated with a degree in pharmacology from the University of Liverpool in 2007, and I chose to join the army. And I served for 6 years before going to King's to do a master's. And in the preceding time, so since being at King's, I have continued to serve in the Reserve Army and deliver sort of strategy, risk, and performance management services as a consultant around the world using my military experiences. So although more recently my PhD has certainly taken centre stage, I suppose it's understandable at times that I've found the culture in academia a bit of a struggle. What is ingrained in for many is not for me. I've been institutionalized in a very different sector. So 8 years since graduating, I returned to academia to do my master's at King's. Great course, but having been outside of academia for some time, my first sort of experiences was that I was appalled by how some lecturers would treat students. I met the rude professor. Either I'd been very fortunate to not experience this before, or my perspectives had changed. And so it was shocking for me to see a lecturer adopt really poor teaching methods so as to undermine and embarrass students so they lose all confidence and don't actually even engage. And so there are definitely many different roles in academia for when considering what good leadership is. But if you're a lecturer, I would argue a key leadership responsibility is to create a positive learning environment. I then came to Imperial. My first year as an MRes, and I did 3 lab-based rotations, which I enjoyed very much, and were all very positive research and learning environments. But when I started my PhD, I found myself in a more difficult situation. I thought I could make it work, but my PhD and then subsequent career opportunities would actually suffer as a result. My supervisor, unfortunately, wasn't able to create the learning and research environment that we would expect. What I believe was actually largely down to lack of funding or grant income, as well as leadership, mentoring and coaching and support of that supervisor. Things in the lab were deteriorating, and I was in this very unprofessional working environment, and I became very, very quickly increasingly uncomfortable with the situation and the questionable research practices that I was witnessing. And I also had concerns about my supervisor's well-being as well. So I reported the situation to my second supervisor, who fortunately supported me to change my PhD. And I imagined that the process would be clearly documented, but they weren't. And there was a real disconnect between policy and the middle management expected to enact those policies. And it took a lot of strength and perseverance and backing to get my case heard at the right level, if you like, for a decision to be made. And one day I will share in more detail what happened in the time from me first raising my concern to finally changing my PhD programme. But this is what I want to share for now. So both me and the PI were both victims of poor leadership. The process for dealing with such issues is not well documented, and there's a real disconnect between middle managers and people at the top, which meant that the people that had the role to protect me and to protect my supervisor were not well equipped to do so. And I'm only here because I had backing. I had someone listen to me. If I had been in my early 20s, I would never have had, the confidence or the insight to pursue this and my transfer so doggedly. And it's likely that without my experience, I wouldn't have even identified the issues early on enough to actually do something about it. So it doesn't take long, though, to realize that my situation wasn't a one-off or isn't a one-off. It's happening all the time. And in fact, much worse things are happening. And so when we talk about bullying and harassment, my story, of course, pales into insignificance. And since then, I have become more interested in trying to address these issues. And the more engrossed you get in trying to understand our culture, the more you see the breadth and depth of the issues that exist and the damage that could be occurring. So on the slides are the words that researchers use to describe our culture in the Wellcome Trust 2020 Research Culture Survey. And it does sadly look like many are just about surviving. And our culture is characterized by overworking, quantity over quality, focus on metrics, and integrity can be undermined. Many different types of people are disadvantaged. There are individual gains at team expense, toxic behaviors like bullying, harassment, unaccountability. A large amount of the workforce are on precarious contracts with little job security, and a large amount of important work and important roles are not even recognized. So we do have to be cognizant of the impact of the incentive structure, and I know this has been touched on already, but the impact that it has on research and researchers. Ill behaviours appear as, to influence our culture, but also as a result of our culture. And it's a scary thought for me that many people may not even be aware of the impact of their behaviour. But I do also have no doubt that most people are trying their best, but are perhaps constrained by the system. So there's a clear need for change. And for culture change, we need robust leadership at all levels. So in my mind, leadership is both the driver and the solution to improving research culture. And therefore we have to value leadership development and good leadership. And I asked myself, where is the training? How can we ensure that people are equipped for their jobs? How can we prevent examples of failing leadership? And so I strongly believe that we need to better equip people for their role as as leaders, and leadership development is an area that is often overlooked. So interestingly, and James, you touched on this, in the Wellcome Trust survey, results show that there is a disconnect between researchers' perception of their management skills and the ability to practice. So 80% of researchers who manage people say they have the knowledge and skills to manage a diverse team, but only 48% have received training. And those being managed often miss out on critical aspects of good management. So only half have received feedback on their performance or had a performance appraisal in the past year. So in the short time that I've been in academia, leadership is being discussed much more readily. And a lot of those discussions are centered around the need for leadership investment. And I would like to advance those conversations. I think we now need to start defining what leadership looks like for all the different roles. And then we need to do the hardest part, which is, determine how do we train everyone as leaders? How do we ensure that people feel supported and equipped to lead effectively? So I hope that telling a bit of my army story, that I can demonstrate the importance of leadership, how better leadership training will contribute to creating a more positive working environment for researchers and research to thrive. So my leadership lessons started at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where all British Army officers are trained. It's a year-long, physically and mentally demanding course. And I think the thing that it teaches you the most is the value of great teamwork. So the Sandhurst motto is serve to lead. So we should be motivated not by self-interest, but in service to others. So you will put the safety, well-being, comfort above that of your own. And I strongly feel that research for me is a form of service. It's not necessarily the pushing of the safety and well-being and comfort of others above that of your own, but it's more about encapsulating what is important, that we have a role to look after the people in our charge, that you perform research with the utmost integrity, and you do it not for your own gain. The leadership is based on the values and identity of the led, and it's important for me here at this point to stress that we need to separate military service from political will and the role of militaries. The values comprise the ethical foundations, and the British Army, along with many other militaries around the world, must abide to the highest value standards. These are the values that provide moral support in very challenging situations and ensure that the law of armed conflict is obeyed. But they also provide within an organisation the basis for trust. So for us, courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, loyalty and selfless commitment are much more than words on a page. From the outset, these become ingrained and they're applied through everything that the Army as an organisation does, so from policies all the way through to an individual. And values are upheld by our leadership behaviours. And so when I reflect, I think it's important to consider what the most sort of important characteristics of a leader are. I purposely avoid talking about personality traits. These are often very unhelpful because everyone is very different. They can be gender biased, and it's better to consider actions. So firstly, I've learned to lead myself. I understand what motivates me, how to be determined, how I can challenge myself to achieve my aims and aspirations. And through my time in the Army, I've become very self-aware. I think it's very important for everyone to have that self-awareness, particularly if you're in a leadership position or in a position of influence over others. And so you need to recognise what your own strengths and weaknesses are and how you respond to extreme pressure, so that you can control and recognise specific behaviours so that you don't have a negative impact on others. I've also decided now as an academic sort of what kind of researcher and academic I want to be and what success will look like for me, how I want to work, how I'm going to try to navigate the system, what I value and how I'll demonstrate my values. Secondly, you have to know your team. Value each individual by understanding who they are, what motivates them and what they value. Everyone's strengths and weaknesses need to be recognised, to be effectively managed and to lead the team effectively. And delegation is really key. Work should be delegated based upon an individual's strength, which will allow them to make a valued contribution and will allow a group to work more effectively together. And lastly, it's lead by example. In simple terms, I mean, be a role model, live the values that you expect others to uphold, communicate your values consistently, and the best way of communicating them is by demonstrating, and that will generate sort of integrity, trust, and loyalty. You can't just say this is what you believe. You must be seen to be doing. And through honing these characteristics, a leader will be in a much better position to support and nurture an individual or a team to achieve their aims, whether that's a military task or to produce quality research. So this is a photo of me and my team in Afghanistan in the summer of 2012. This is the smallest of teams that I've had the privilege to command. And this was our first day on the ground. We're a Royal Engineers search team, and our job was to understand the threat posed by explosive hazards. So primarily the threat of improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. Our mission was to search, find, and destroy these devices to save lives, civilians and soldiers alike, as these devices are indiscriminate. So my role is to understand the threat, to work with our multinational, very culturally diverse partners, to devise a plan and then remove the threats with my team. So what was key to being an effective team? So like I already said, the first part is to get to know each person, what motivates them, what their aspirations are, and what challenges as well they have in their home. I was responsible for every aspect of their life, from their career management, training and development through to their actual mortal life. But they were also responsible for my life. So there's a saying in the military, which is train hard and fight easy, and that's what we did. We each had very specific roles and responsibilities, and these need to be demonstrated and understood by each person within the team, which would also then ensure that we would have contingency should something happen. And so someone would be able to step in. I also wanted my team to feel empowered to do the right thing, particularly if something would happen to me. So we pushed each other, we challenged each other through our training so that we could build confidence, and everyone was encouraged to think independently. So once we started operating in Afghanistan, we were a very slick team. And that's not to say that there weren't areas for improvement or lessons that could be learned. So after every task, we would take the time for a debrief and reflect collectively. What worked, what didn't, how could we improve? And it'd also make sure that we would look to find and identify what the positives are, and we would celebrate our successes. And that can be quite challenging to maintain that perspective during more difficult times. It's also my responsibility to ensure that we look after ourselves, rest between task and opportunity, taking an opportunity to do exercise or to play games, speak to friends and family is really important to keep up morale. And it's often thought of as a treat, something you can only do when you're not busy, but it's actually really critical to your own well-being and to that of a team and everyone's healthy function. And I do draw parallels here with academia and the culture of long working hours, like all the time, and people probably don't take the time to stop to consider what the impact of that is. Firstly, I think it's likely to not be that productive. Secondly, there is a cost to individuals' health and well-being and their family lives. And so there are several factors that obviously influence team success, but I think the most important is trust. And trust is the glue that holds together any group. It's the belief or confidence that one has in the reliability, integrity, and honesty of another. Trust is never blindly given, it always has to be earned. And trust is built through honest, open, transparent communication. And building trust creates psychological safety. And that's what allows people to be willing to take risk, to speak their minds, to be creative, and to stick up for what they know to be true and right. So it's really difficult for me to not compare my army experiences with that of academia. And I'm sure that there are many other sectors that we can listen and learn from too. So firstly, it's who can or should be a leader. There seems to be a focus on leadership being the exclusive business of an individual in a formal position, usually held at a relatively senior position. And one of the most frustrating things about this is that often individuals are not selected based upon their leadership ability, but on their research success. And I'd like to challenge this and say that everyone can and is a leader. And in academia, there are many informal leadership positions. We can all think of as PhD students and postdocs, they supervise undergrads and masters. So we really do need to invest in everyone's leadership training at the earliest opportunity, recognize individuals within their roles, and then we can hold all leaders accountable and support them in their role. Another sort of common misconception, I suppose, of the army is that there's an extreme hierarchical structure and we operate this strict command and control. So someone that barks orders to get things done. And that doesn't build trust nor create independent forward thinkers, and it leaves people scared to make decisions. So the army, in fact, uses the explicit hierarchy to empower those at lower levels. So through trust and delegation, people operate independently and demonstrate leadership and initiative wherever possible. So in the army, this is called mission command. Commanders and senior leaders explain their intent, ensure that everyone understands it and is aligned, and then allows people the freedom to go about achieving their aims as they see fit. Oh, sorry, I've just scrolled through too quickly. So, but academia is in fact much closer. I'll just go back to so this sort of caricature of the command and control style of leadership. Senior academics have this incredible power over junior staff and students. Senior academics promoted on the basis of their academic credentials, then are put in charge of a team, and then they can find themselves out of their depth, and they then rely on micromanagement and in the worst cases bullying. So it seems that there is this historical failing in institutions and funders have not valued leadership development, so individuals haven't invested in it. I think training is a really important part of everybody's everyday life, and in particular in academia. And you can build confidence through interesting and progressive training. In the army, both technical and leadership training is delivered at key career stages. The fundamental principles always remain the same, but they're revisited as you progress. And so the army tries to nurture soldiers' desire to learn and explore the ways of doing things. Whereas in academia, I feel there's a much more sink or swim culture. A lot of us are self-taught, a lot is following what's gone before, even if it's on shaky ground. And so to me, it's almost no wonder that imposter syndrome is rife. And so my last point on this slide is perhaps what I struggled with most, and it's interesting to hear that that's come back from the University of Glasgow surveys, which it's very individualistic, and academia can be a very lonely and isolating place. And I'd like to challenge us to become less individualistic and become more team-based and outward orientated. I think, unfortunately, many of the current incentives undermine collaborative working and certainly recognition of it, and in fact don't, of course, then reflect how we actually work. So leadership training has also given me an understanding about the need for leadership in the scholarly community. In the military, values-based leadership is entwined in everything that we do. So even learning my technical trade, leadership is an important component. So research excellence is really another reason to address the lack of leadership training in academia. Research integrity means conducting research in a way which allows others to have trust and confidence in the methods used and the findings that result from it. Unfortunately, I think that there are some bad practices that are quite ingrained. And I don't doubt this has happened in the most part unwillingly and is not intentional. And I appreciate that the culture, of perverse incentives, this reporting of novel and exciting results in high impact journals that is considered critical to career success has no doubt fueled the situation that we find ourselves in. But within academic institutions, conducting research with integrity means reaching professional standards that's expected. But what I'm sort of trying to get at, I suppose, is what happens when these standards seem to have slipped or the bar is set so low. How is it that we can all think of so many examples of researchers failing to uphold integrity? And why do we see so many get away with it? Why isn't science better at correcting itself? And I think a failure in leadership is why. So in this article that I've cited here, The Natural Selection for Bad Science, they discuss that despite the continued introduction of guidelines, there's still no improvement in the methods. And they argue that in order to improve the culture of science, a shift must be made away from correcting misunderstanding and towards rewarding and understanding. So we have to ask questions about the validity of research. And I think prior to COVID-19, we were already in a bit of a research crisis, one of research waste. And so it's really morally incumbent upon us to improve. We need good collaborative leadership at all levels to inspire and drive the cultural change. So how do we get there? So the lessons that I've learned is that leadership is based on context and the values and identity of the led. And we need a cultural shift. So changing behaviour begins with evolving beliefs. When we begin to value something more, people will begin to do it. So we need to really care about our researchers and how research is being done. And these values can provide the guiding principles for what we do, and how we manifest these values does much to define us as individuals and institutions. So when we consider incentives, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we're valuing? How can we ensure that we measure what it is that we want and that we need? And how can we identify what it is that we really care about and reward it? You know, we need to work together to determine what it is that we value. An academic leadership code could provide the underlying principles that promulgate from the mission throughout all our policies down to the individual. You know, values ensure that we're bound by a very clear moral and ethical code, and that ensures, you know, then we can have a positive environment for researchers and research to thrive. So Imperial at the moment are currently co-producing our institutional values. But I think within any, you know, with any team or any institution, whatever size you are, I really recommend discussing values, because people put different weight on different values. They mean different things to different people. And in the way in which they can be upheld is very situational. So it's a really worthy and enlightening task to do. And so in terms of a leadership model, I'd like to introduce one theory, and that is collaborative leadership. And I feel that this is something that is most suited to academia. It has much in common with both servant leadership models, so that's looking after others, and a transformational leadership model, which is developing others to get the best out. So it starts from the premise that if you bring people, the right people together in a constructive way with good information sharing, they'll create authentic visions and strategies for addressing the shared concerns of the community. So we have a traditional view of leadership, which is in the simplest sense is that there's a leader, those that are being led, the situation, and a particular task that must be accomplished. And the leader is of absolute importance. And this model is extremely outdated. And unfortunately, in academia, we still kind of have this lone genius model prevailing, and it doesn't reflect our reality. You know, even our research celebrities, they have a large team of people around them. So effective leadership today really requires a shared leadership approach, where leaders work within teams and teams of teams to accomplish tasks. You know, individual leaders cannot possibly possess all the necessary knowledge and skill to succeed in today's challenging environment. And so we really have to rely on others with different skills, and the system does need to recognise this. So the themes that underpin collaborative leadership: firstly, silo busting. Silo mentality is synonymous with power struggles, lack of cooperation, and loss of productivity. So it's necessary for leaders to help people find common ground and work together. In a collaborative environment, teams are encouraged to work together to share information, resources, knowledge, time, and effort. We have to build trust. We have to promote learning, so the collaborative environment is nurturing and offers the opportunity to share knowledge and experience among each other, as well as educate members on an ongoing basis. And they should promote diversity. Not that we need to go beyond the fact that anyone who wants to should be able to conduct and participate in research, but also, you know, research has shown that diverse groups are more effective at problem solving. And I think it's particularly pertinent as we start to envisage a new research culture or build a new research culture, that co-production must include traditionally underrepresented groups if we're to truly create a positive environment for all. So the skills that we learn during our PhD and postdoctoral research are typically not those required to lead a research group. And my understanding is that there's little to no training in personnel management, project management, budget management, teaching, coaching, and mentoring is received. And there's a little bit available to those who seek it out. And yet these are the skills that are required on a daily basis. You know, and individuals are promoted on the basis of their academic credentials, but these don't reflect the skills that they require in leadership positions. And of course, this also doesn't account for the many that are in informal leadership positions. So what should we expect from our leadership training? I think there is an opportunity to learn from ourselves, like within, as well as from other sectors. And what is important is that we create a model that works for us. You know, we need to understand our values and how we can promote a good research culture. And leadership is in itself a form of scholarship. You know, this is what militaries do. They learn and evaluate and adjust, and they do that repeatedly. And it doesn't sit outside of what they do, it's integrated. So my vision for a future is that one day we may not need to have standalone leadership training, it will sit within our technical and other professional development courses. But until then, we need to start now to foster more inclusive research leadership through training. I know there is likely to be large variation in the leadership development offers at institutions. We need to understand what works, what the requirements of this type of training are, and courses can be led by experienced academics, but they can be co-produced and shaped by everyone to meet our collective needs. So to start summing up, leadership is about people and relationships with people. To be effective leaders, we must understand the situation fully and appreciate the impact that has on ourselves and the individual and team dynamics. I know a lot of people may feel uncomfortable with the term servant leadership or leadership as a service to others. So I want to start by saying it isn't a form of noble suffering, but what it is. Firstly, we have to look after ourselves and lead by example by prioritising our own self-care. It's critical to our own well-being and to that of the team. And we should do our best to not perpetuate unhealthy behaviours. So, for example, overworking, quantity over quality, use of poor metrics as a measure of success. And good leadership results in individuals feeling valued, having their strengths appreciated, being challenged to improve, encouraged to think and use their initiative. And individuals can then expect that good performance will be recognised and rewarded, and similarly individuals can expect that any ill behaviour or unacceptable behaviour will not be tolerated. And good academic leaders will promote a positive learning environment, destigmatise failure and success, they'll be inclusive and will value the impact and input that each team member has, recognising everyone's contributions, which will then in turn boost confidence and motivation and support professional development. And there's another role, which is our mission, which is as researchers to perform research with the utmost integrity. You know, I do recognise that lack of investment in leadership development and the incentive structures that exist perhaps undermine at the moment the possibility of a culture in which serve to lead can be truly embodied, which sort of brings me back in full circle, which is to change the culture, we have to change what we value and the incentive structures. The leadership skills are fundamental for academic service, and the wider research environment and the incentives that are set by institutions and funders and policymakers, you know, do influence our research behaviours and can negatively impact our culture. And so to change the culture, we urgently need to change the incentives that are created by the environment, and we need a systems approach to that. But it's also important to remember that despite career stage, we as individuals also have agency and a role to play in shaping our environment. You know, we can push the boundaries of what is possible. We can mobilise others to make positive changes and to make changes happen more quickly. And we can make a positive difference in our own spheres of influence. So my 3 take-homes: we need shared values as organisations and individuals, because good leadership is based upon first principles, and though we will face different challenges at different points of our careers, they will always stay the same. Progressive education and training is needed. This is something that must be valued. It underpins everything that we do, and good leadership will be key to our success, the success of the people around us, and ensures our research will be of the highest value. And individuals will be empowered through training, and because good leadership takes practice and commitment. Leadership will not be a panacea, but it will go some way to creating the type of, you know, cohesive and supportive research culture that Tanita was discussing. So to finish, I like this quote from Manoush Shafiq, director of LSE. So in the past, jobs were about muscles, now they're about brains, but in the future, they'll be about the heart. So I think the future is now. We need to care about our researchers and our research and how it's being done. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing this with you further.
Nadia, thank you very much for the talk. It was fascinating. And also something that the delegates won't be aware, you're not actually in the, what time is it where you are at the moment?
It's now 6:10. I'm in Colombia.
Nadia's in Colombia. She joined the conference at 4:45 a.m. her time, and I think, you know, that's definitely above and beyond the Portuguese. So thank you very much for that. There's a lot of interesting questions. I think the talks very timely, especially as the issues of leadership and management have been focused on by the research community a lot in the last couple of years. And I mentioned in Nottingham Lace's discussion session earlier how the Wellcome Trust had wonderful, I use that word ironically, survey results where most managers replied saying, yes, we're fantastic managers, and most people being managed said,
Not so
are you
much.
really though? I also like your focus on self-care, that to be effective leaders and effective subordinates, we have to look after ourselves, and that's incredibly important at all times, but especially in these very stressful conditions which we're all living in. Okay, so we've got quite a lot of questions. An early one, you talked about your situation as a PhD student. If having been through that, what advice would you give to a PhD student who finds himself in a similar situation to you? And also turning around, how could supervisors handle those, and people in leadership positions handle those situations differently?
So I think these situations are extremely difficult, and each one will have its own sort of characteristics of what's going on and what's going wrong, and and I think my advice to PhD students who find themselves in that situation, I think first and foremost, it sounds quite, I suppose, ruthless, but start making notes. Start by just documenting what's happening, what you're trying to do about it. Try to improve the situation, because these things take time. And I would, provided there isn't a complete breakdown in your relationship, I would try to discuss this with the supervisor who you're having problems with, because often I think in the early stages, it might feel like things are all going horribly wrong, but actually it's just about a lack of clear communication between two people. And so maybe actually you can find a solution. So, my first thing would be to look for solutions, try to understand the situation as objectively as possible, and make notes to help with that, so that you can say, right, how can I improve this for myself? How can I improve this for the team? What support do I want to ask my supervisor for? Because often we're all very busy in our own little bits that it may not even be, the supervisor may not even be aware that you may be struggling. However, if that doesn't work, or things are beyond that stage, I think it's important to find people within your institution that will support you, that will listen and help you navigate moving on, or whatever it is that you want to do next, whether that is working, maybe working more frequently with another group, or whether it is, what I had to do in the end, which was move on completely. So yes, look for solutions and then find support are my advice. In terms of leadership, I think the first thing, fortunately, when I went to my second supervisor, he took the time to listen to me, to listen to the case that I presented, and was clear in what we needed to do. But when we went to, I suppose, the middle management, so, the postgraduate school, they weren't so clear on what needed to happen and how it needed to. And I would say that their response lacked empathy, and lacked, I suppose, they didn't have a clear plan and didn't have any idea of how they were going to navigate it. It felt for me at the time, where I was looking for, I suppose, comfort, I felt very, very alone, very isolated, and very concerned that actually this huge risk, I'd left a career that I'd taken a huge risk, which many PhD students do, to follow and pursue an aspiration, was all hanging in the balance, and I didn't feel that that was understood. So I think a bit of empathy, I think, is the most important thing at that moment in time, and honesty, that if you don't know the process, say, well, I'm not sure how this is going to work out, but this is what we're going to have to work through this together. And I think that's what I didn't get to begin with.
A question from Catherine asking about the applicability of sort of leadership lessons learned in a military setting to academia. There's a perception that in the military discipline places sort of orders first and those are rarely challenged. And there's a perception in research that this is about innovation and sort of challenging rules and accepted dogma. So does that kind of make applying leadership lessons learned in a military setting challenging to academia, or is there some more fundamental common ground regardless of those perceived differences?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think my answer is firstly is that there is actually much more fundamental common ground. Leadership, like I say, is about people and understanding people, what motivates them, and bringing people together to achieve their aims or their aspirations. And so when we compare the military and we compare academia, actually their aims or their missions are not too dissimilar. The army wants to bring groups of people together to work in very challenging, fluid environments, obey an ethical and moral code to achieve its aims. Academia does the same, brings very broad, disparate research groups together potentially, follows an ethical moral code to solve some of the greatest challenges that exist to society today. So I feel I think when you take it to a sort of a really kind of macro level, it's actually very comparable. The idea that the army creates orders and is very strict isn't quite true. Like I said in my talk, we do have this process called mission command. So a commander, so a senior leader, just very clearly communicates their intent and then allows the teams the freedom to achieve their aims and their part of that, of whatever that is, so whatever the mission is. And I think academia, strangely, sometimes can be more constrained than that. And often we're not given as much freedom as we perhaps would like. So in the most general sense, I think when we take leadership lessons from the military, I think we're taking them in terms of bringing people together to achieve great things. And that's what academia is doing as well.
Thank you. One final question. Do you think for an anonymous attendee, do you think the lone genius competitive model predisposes academia to being averse to exposing one's vulnerability? So academics can be averse to acknowledging that one can be lacking in certain skills or in need in training and self-reflection. And that echoes another question from Nicola, who says, in the same way no one ever admits they're a bad driver, and I never admit I'm falling asleep on the sofa, is part of the problem that people will not want to perhaps reflect that they could do things differently in terms of leadership.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's just totally, like, I think it is sort of human behavior, isn't it? I'm obviously the best driver, and I think that's why we need to put in place systems to support people through that, to make people not feel as scared or as judged or as worried that the world's going to come crashing down around them because they haven't got a specific skill. I think there's nothing worse than not focusing on an area that needs improvement. And so we need to do so in a manner that is helpful and supportive, rather than in a manner that perhaps would just perpetuate that fear and turn people off from doing it. I think one of the things that I feel was strange to me was that my experience of in the military is that we invest so much in leadership training. It's the bread and butter of what the military does. But many other organizations, different sectors, do the same. And it was strange to me that that isn't occurring in academia, given the breadth and responsibility by the time someone's a PI. They're juggling so many balls. I can't believe that we don't invest in leadership training. And I think once we start valuing that more, people, they go to training that is actually useful to them, then I think we'll sort of, I suppose, dispel some of those fears, and will slowly equip people better to be able to do their jobs. So in the end, it will, maybe that hyper-competitive environment will still exist. I've come from a very competitive environment. We will still always fear what our weaknesses are, but at least we will then have an opportunity to address them.
Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating talk. Lots of interesting questions, points in the chat, lots of great feedback. Echoing what I said about Denise's work in Glasgow earlier, we are still talking with Nadia about the work that she's doing in this area and how we can sort of take it to a wider audience. So if we haven't been able to address your questions, comments today, hopefully we can do so in the future. Thank you so much, especially considering the time over there. So please mute yourself and shut your eyes for a bit, or go and get some much needed caffeine. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.